This presentation is provided by BoardPack LLC for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and not necessarily those of BoardPack. On behalf of BoardPack, we welcome you to today's webinar. BoardPack has teamed up with Amazon's #1 best-selling author in board governance, Thomas Bakewell, and fundraising guru Carol Weisman to help educate boards on the latest industry trends. The Boardroom webinar series will focus on different topics each month through the end of 2015. I wanted to mention really quickly that BoardPack is a secure, affordable, and easy-to-use paperless board meeting solution. Users can access materials from the native iPad app or through a web browser on other devices. Private annotations, minutes builder, and unlimited document storage are a few highlights of what we have to offer. Before we jump into today's topic, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Thomas Bakewell works to bring out the best your team has to offer. He is the author of the book, Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Bakewell has advised and directed CEOs and presidents of large for-profit and nonprofit corporations. His vast board experience has made him a leader and go-to source in board governance. Carol Weisman, president of Board Builders, is an internationally known speaker, author, trainer, and consultant. Carol specializes in volunteerism, fundraising, and governance. Carol won a Telly Award for her PBS special, Building a Board with a Passion for Mission. Her board experience is vast, having served on 38 boards and served as president of 7. Carol and Tom, take it away.
This is Carol Weisman. I'm here today with my friend and colleague Tom Bakewell, who is the king of strategy. This is one of his absolute favorite topics, other than his kids and his dog. And so, let's get started, Tom.
So glad to be here. So the timeline is what, 2 hours?
Yeah, 4 for you.
All right, we're going to keep it tight. We're going to keep it tight today. And hey, I got a question for you. So we're talking about strategy and who owns it. How do you get strategy just right with a board and a management? The theory is it's a love fest. Everybody gets together. What have you seen about board and management in terms of strategy? Who owns it? Who makes it happen? What works?
Everybody has to be committed to strategy.
Okay.
And that means frontline personnel as well.
Okay, well, that's a bit of a dodge. I don't know. Come on, who owns it? Who owns it, the board or management?
Well, what do you think?
Let's talk about that.
Okay. Here we go. We're off and
So
running.
we got to get strategy just right. It's essential to the success. And the question becomes, and it is a fundamental question, who owns the strategy? Who drives it? Who's ultimately responsible for the strategy? What do you do when opinions and visions collide? Hey, you ever had this happen?
Oh my gosh, yes.
You're in a boardroom.
Yes.
And there's a board member who is obstreperous and loquacious and verbal and
rich,
and they think they know where the organization ought to go.
Yes.
What happens?
It really depends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the biggest challenges for board chairs is this is not part, and frequently it's mission creep.
Right, okay.
So you're an environmental group and this person wants a dance company.
Yes, okay.
And they're willing to fund it.
Yeah, I've got one right now. I'll give you an example. I've got a company where they've been fabulously successful for decades, but they may be turning into a buggy whip company.
Mm-hmm.
And the products that they sell have basically been manufacturing based, i.e. environmental issues. And there's a wonderful, brilliant family member who thinks that their mantra should be going green.
Yeah.
And that's a key strategic issue. And until they thresh that out, they are going to be dealing with some real battles. So the question becomes in developing strategy management and the board, notice it doesn't say versus the board. Let's talk about 5 steps of process from strategy development. I want to be real clear. This is from an organization that, I do a lot of work with, the National Association of Corporate Directors, top organization. Here's what they lay out as 5 key steps, and I like this. You like 4 steps, I like 3, they like 5. Here we go. Agree on the vision and mission with management. Now, I see that as problematic on occasion because a lot of times it's really hard to get clear on that vision and mission.
Yes.
But that aside, that's the first step. Second, establish guidelines. Identify goals and expectations for the process. Who's going to do it? A lot of boards I work with, they have an annual strategy retreat. Great idea. A lot of boards that are a little sleepy only get together every couple of years on strategy. But the question is, what's our approach going to be to strategy? Discuss strategic alternatives and management's recommendation. I firmly believe, as they suggest here, management needs to bring the overarching strategy to the board, and then the board can get knee deep into it if they want, or just sign off on it. Look very carefully at the alternatives, which is what we're talking about, and the recommendations. Approve the strategy in written documents. A lot of people like to blue sky. Get it on paper and in writing. It doesn't have to be 100 pages. In fact, the tighter it is, usually the better. Now, here's a tip that the NACD believes in terms of good governance, and I think it's spot on. You talk about strategy at every board meeting. Have you seen that in the not-for-profit world?
Absolutely, and it makes all the difference
It
between
really does.
staying on task
Right.
and going off into the weeds.
Getting into the weeds and reviewing the minutes and all the other things that are important, but not the most important. Okay.
And here's one of the challenges. Risk is inherent in strategy.
Well, it's just a concept that we need to put out there right on the front. When you start thinking about strategy, look, the reality is you have to balance risk and strategy. You can't talk strategy without understanding risk. There's an interesting term. Again, the NACD's got some beautiful documents on this if you want to pursue them. They actually have forms. They have a risk appetite statement, etc. Just imagine there's a teeter-totter there with risk on one side and reward on the other. Strategy on one side, risk on the other. How much risk are we willing to take? I used the example recently of this terrific business I'm working with where the family member says we got to go green and we've been living, all our wealth has come from manufacturing. Well, that's a great theory, but what's the risk of shutting the business down completely? You know, it's an ugly picture and it's just not a viable concept. It could be, perhaps, but immediately it's not. So you always have to say, what is the company's risk appetite statement? And again, it's a technical term. You can check those things out. But so, for example, a risk appetite statement for a bank or a small community bank is going to be substantially different than a risk appetite statement for an entrepreneurial startup company or a manufacturing company, etc. And then on the risk appetite, you see here some of the bullet points of what's included. What are the foreseeable risks? There's always unforeseeable, of course. That's the nature of risk. What capital do we have? What talent do we have? What acceptable volatility can we take?
And then in the nonprofit sector, you really, instead of looking at stakeholders, you're looking at vulnerable populations.
Okay.
So if you start to house domestic violence victims,
Right.
and you decide that you want to have a high-risk strategy, you're putting people's lives at risk.
So literally the type of client that you would serve or the type of patient or recipient you would serve can bring substantial risk with it as well.
And again, as you were saying, in your example, there are nonprofits that are very willing to risk, and
bet.
especially in the arts, they're willing to do something that's very avant-garde.
On the edge.
Absolutely.
Right.
So it's the same concept,
Very
but
good.
nonprofits tend to be very risk averse.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, well, that's the nature. In fact, that's a trivia question I'll bring up. I like to ask people when I'm working with boards, what's the difference between a for-profit and not-for-profit corporation at the core base? And the element is the not-for-profits are geared, traditionally, they're geared towards preserving and protecting assets, i.e. low risk, whereas for-profits are geared towards making money, i.e. high risk. Now, you can go all around the horn on that discussion, but a key point. Let's talk about milestones. You need to have some milestones. Objectives are established. Who's going to set them? Is it going to be management, and is the board going to sign off? There's some organizations where the board actually likes to get knee-deep and hands-in, and particularly in startup companies or what's called small-cap companies, or what about on the not-for-profit boards? Do you see where the board actually wants to own or get involved in the strategy from the beginning?
Very much, and
Yep.
here's the difference. In the for-profit world, they may be asked to help or be a part of the venture capital.
Right.
But these are donor dollars, and the board members are donors, ideally. And so it's their dollars that's going into this strategy.
They're invested.
Right, and they want a solid ROI, and they want an ROI that's consistent with the mission and their values.
Very interesting. Okay. So you get the issue of coming up with a strategy, short-term versus long-term. Also, what committee handles it? Now, this is again, this is kind of a governance theory, but particularly in larger corporations where you have a lot of committees, who owns the strategy? Very important question. What committee? Is it the governance committee? Do you have a separate strategy committee? How do you handle that?
Well, and sometimes it's both.
Sometimes it's both. So let's talk about when you develop a strategy. You have to look at risk. We've talked about that in depth. The board is a participant in the entire process. At a minimum, you need to keep them informed and engaged. The board involvement provides directors with invaluable insight. You have to keep the board involved so they can give you good oversight and good feedback and be plugged in. The best boards talk about strategy at every meeting. And here's another pearl that I've learned from my time and a friend at the NACD, and I truly believe it. Strategy starts in the nominating committee. Are you bringing people on board who are strategic thinkers?
Here's one of the mistakes that's made in the nonprofit world.
Tell me.
And what they do is they take the former president and make him or her chair of nominating, which is totally wrong. And the reason is that the new people have to reflect the upcoming strategy.
Right.
And that person may not have been, because he or she's on their way out.
They may not be fresh. They may not be up to date.
Right. And because you're so right about nominating being tied to strategy. This is really almost the Supreme Court kind of decision.
Sure. Okay. I.e., the next Supreme Court justice we get may be around for 30 years, so let's choose wisely and choose carefully.
Absolutely.
Okay. Before we go on here, just one or two other comment on this because it's so important. Probably the most dramatic change strategically I've ever seen in an organization was when a board elected to change the entire nature of their board. This was a strategic decision. You could argue it was a board case, but here's what happened. It was a small, struggling college that had board members who were not really invested because they were high-profile people. It was a small, kind of not well-known college. They were there because somebody important asked them to be there, but they weren't really engaged or invested. Organization got into serious trouble, and the decision that was made very strategically, but almost out of crisis and necessity, was that we are going to go get entrepreneurs, and our board is primarily going to be people who are entrepreneurial, who know about doing things on the fly, who know about being creative, who know about managing budgets tight, and they were going to move away from the corporate model of just bringing in the next young executive on the rise. And it worked beautifully for them. So it was a key strategic change in the boardroom that led to a renewal of the entire organization and multiple new strategies after that.
So tell me about the why. I mean, what do you come on, Tom.
Why?
There have been nonprofits forever that had no strategy.
Sure, absolutely.
Why do you really need one?
Oh, that's the same thing for the for-profit side too. So why does strategy really matter so much? We're going to talk about this the rest of the day. Why so few really get strategy and strategic planning just right?
Not the rest of the whole day, Tom.
Okay, for the next 20 minutes or
okay.
so. Tips for getting strategy and strategic planning just right, and why knowing your critical issues is a foundation for achieving success. Now, let's talk for a minute about that term, critical issues, okay? We could have all kinds of broad definitions. To me, critical issues boils down to what are the 2 or 3 things we have to get right. You got any familiarity or definitions with that term if you were looking at an organization and saying, what are our critical issues?
One of my favorite critical issues that one of my clients went through was...
It's not shopping or a new purse, is it?
No,
all
it's
right.
worse. It's they called it the PBIS committee, and that was put butts in seats.
Put butts in seats. That's a great strategy.
Yes, and their problem was they weren't filling up.
Yes.
And so they had, their initial strategy was to fill every single seat, whether it was paid or not.
Right.
That was the first year. The
Super.
Second
Great
year strategy was to have 100% sold out with paid seats.
Right.
The third year was to win a regional Tony.
Right.
And they did.
They
the
did
third
it.
year.
And they all started with a put butts in seat strategy.
PBIS.
I love it. Easy to remember, easy to get. Everybody could understand it.
Now, let me tell you what their BHAG is. And
Okay.
that's a Jim Collins term from Good to Great. Big Hairy
Audacious Goal.
And their goal was that during a divorce, the season tickets would be disputed as part of the settlement.
Oh, my.
That they would be so valuable.
Yeah, that's
which
it.
does happen with the Green Bay Packers
Yes,
tickets and
yes,
a number of
great
other teams.
story.
So I don't think they ever achieved that one, but it was a noble BHAG.
Well, I'm going to come back to and follow up with another story on strategy before I get in too much trouble about my comment about shopping in the purse. My friend Carol and I had a big strategic proposal out to do some great strategy work for a wonderful organization well known in town and across the country. And she was supposed to go to lunch with the executive to close the deal. I was traveling that day, and I was anxiously awaiting the call, which should have come in within an hour or two. So about 6 hours later, she advised me. I finally tracked her down. She goes, "Oh, yeah, we closed that in about 15 minutes." And I said, "What in the world did you do for 5 or 6 hours?" And your response was?
She needed a purse.
Oh, golly. Okay. And
we went shopping.
Yeah. You discussed a lot of other things at that meeting, too, but I won't get into that. Okay, here we go. So why strategy really does matter. Look, strategy is as serious as a heart attack. If you don't get it right, it can kill you. Great strategy is a work in process. Have you ever seen a strategy done really, really quick?
I'll tell you one that was well thought through and had to change on a dime.
Okay.
And this was probably, among all the stupid things I've said in my life, one of the stupidest. I was on the national board of the Hemophilia Foundation.
Yes.
And then they were doing a lot of scenario building. And the facilitator said, and what would happen if there was a complete contamination of the blood supply? And I said, in my total ignorance and was so stupid, I said, right, and what happens if there is a nuclear war? This was 1981, 1982. The blood supply was contaminated by HIV. 100% of the children that had hemophilia died, and we had to change our strategy on a dime.
So you were actually pressing it without even knowing it.
We had this consultant was brilliant, and I was ignorant, and unfortunately, we had to be really facile in making a major change in our strategy.
And that's a key point of strategy I'd like to fall down here where it says markets. I'm skipping a point. Markets can change suddenly, dramatically, precipitously, and overnight. A lot of times people will have a good business model that lasts for 20 or 30 years, and they'll wake up one day and it's not working anymore, and you have to move fast.
Well, you know, the company that suffered was just put out of business was, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a diet supplement called AIDS.
Yes.
And obviously in 1982, that company was not going to be, nobody was taking AIDS.
Gotcha. Very good. Those kinds of things happen. I do believe there used to be a company called Blockbuster, too. And,
I remember Blockbuster.
I think there's still a few of those stores
I think I still
there.
have some of their videos.
I do. Oh, well, you are a criminal type. Strategy can be messy, frustrating, and tough. It's not easy work. It is heavy lifting. And great strategy done right can require major change. So back to the point, why do so few get it just right? Look, challenges defining strategy and strategic planning are difficult. A lot of times people don't want to change. A lot of times the organization's not capable. They don't have the talent they need. We could go on and on. Here's what I want to give a very simple definition of strategy. And there's lots of good definitions, but the one I like best is strategy is simply the management of change.
I think that's a great definition. I think where strategy can also go wrong is when you don't have the experts in the room.
Right. And that's where I get to the point here about 3 key points about getting strategy effectively in managing change. You got to have the right team. You have to ask the right questions and clear roles and a great process in place. Doesn't have to be complicated. Doesn't have to be exotic. But these 3 things are the key point to getting strategy just right. And a lot of times people either don't get this right or they skip the steps. So I got a question for you. What is strategy or strategic planning to you? I've got a few choices here. What is walk through those and tell me what strategy is to you.
One of the things is it can be all these things.
Yes, it can.
I think what great strategy does, and a great strategy planning process, is when you take diverse people together with different points of view.
Right.
And this is where the mess comes in.
The messy part.
The messy part is the more diverse the audience, the group, the more points of view, the
Right.
slower the process, and the better the outcome.
I like to say that when everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks much.
Exactly.
And it usually is in that messy part where the magic comes.
Absolutely. And I think what a really great board and great management team
Yep.
is when they can respectfully disagree.
Right. I like to call it being able to disagree agreeably.
Absolutely.
So let's keep going here and talk about the right strategic questions. Now, there's always what's the best strategic planning questions you've ever heard? Here's 3 or 4 of mine. The first one is as simple as it gets. Where have you been and where are you going? Just think about that. Where have you been and where are you going?
Now, the second one is from one of
Peter
your
Drucker,
favorite
yep,
people.
he was very profound. His question was, what is your business and how's business? Pretty profound question. Thank you, Peter Drucker. Another simple question is what's working and what's not. The third one, the fourth one, actually, I got to get my counting, where it says 3 years there. This one is a little bit stilted and a little bit long, and it comes from a terrific guy named Dan Sullivan, who runs the Strategic Coach. But his question is this. If we were here 3 years from today, having lunch, having dinner, whatever, breakfast, and life was as good as it could get, both personally and professionally, what does that look like? And what would it take to get there? So basically, you're grabbing some vision in the future, you're backing up to it. What I especially like is the personal comment of it. If you've got a board team that's the right group of people, or a management team that's the right group of people, and somebody shows up with breast cancer or some terrible disease, you got to work through that and you got to make that work.
Absolutely.
And one of the great things that I've experienced with strategy, and I'm sure you have too, is you show up and they're all ready and they're all fired up and they say, okay, now get back to us in 9 months because our calendar is such that 9 months from now is really the only time we can deal with it. And the reality is most times the best time to deal with strategy is when?
When you need it.
Right now. Okay.
And I think also
Yep.
the old, and I don't know who this is attributed to, but men plan, God laughs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Say that again.
When men plan, God laughs.
Okay, so that's a great expression. So when is it time to look at a strategy? Well, here's a couple, and I've got a site here on the next slide. We're going to stay right here on this one, but the source for these come from a great book on strategy, which you'll have on the next page of the source. But when is it time to look at strategy? There really are 2 overarching changes. One is, so we've defined strategy as adapting our current circumstances or creating some compelling future. So think about that. We're either modifying the way we're doing things, tweaking it, or we're trying to come up with some new compelling future. And even in those tweaking situations, you can have a situation like you described when it's coming off the rails and we have to act.
Also, I think there's taking advantage of opportunity.
Okay.
And my mother used to say every dog has its day.
Yes.
And this is true with the AIDS crisis, is that nobody would touch it until Elizabeth Taylor went to Ronald Reagan
Right.
and said, Ronnie, you need to do something about
Right.
this. And everything changed and funding opened.
Yep.
And there are, in the nonprofit cycle particularly,
Right.
there are causes that come and go. ALS was a great
The
example.
Ice Bucket, in 1 year they raised $2 or $3 million, and the next year they're back to ground zero.
They actually raised $110 million.
That is a number that I need to remember. $110 million. How much are they going to raise this year?
They're down 10%.
There you go. They're down 10%.
From the year before the
Yes.
Ice Bucket Challenge.
Okay, very good.
And so there are these odd opportunities
Yes.
that come up because somebody's funding drug prevention.
Right.
When Noriega came into power, that's when the DARE program came up.
Right.
And there was an opportunity. So sometimes it's a problem, but sometimes it's grasping at the brass ring that is right
in
there.
front of you. Absolutely. So when is a new strategy needed? Really, there's 2 times. One is when there are, there's an overarching need when your strategy simply isn't working.
Yes.
Something's not working. We have unbalanced budgets on a persistent basis. We simply aren't raising the kind of money we want to raise. The product line we're trying to get to market isn't working. There's something that's simply not working. There's competitive realities that we simply aren't dealing with. The other side is simply when you know you should be doing better and you're not achieving that goal. Okay? So those are 2 great times to look at a new strategy. And when is the right time to consider a new strategy? And there's the title of the book. It's called Hands-On Strategy by William Finney. Bill is a consultant and a college professor at Washington University in St. Louis. So it's Hands-On Strategy. Here's a list that I've annotated a bit, but from his book. And here's what he says about when is it the right time. So you got the two overarching times, but here's some specifics. And he's spot on. I've lived through most of these. There's a new CEO. A new CEO almost always wants to look at strategy.
Let me ask you a question about that. I'm very curious. Do you think you should set strategy in place and then hire the CEO who can and will implement it? Or do you think you should let the new CEO set the strategy?
I would say that's a great strategic question for the board.
Okay.
And the reality is most CEOs worth their salt are going to want to do their own strategy. And even the not so good ones want to do their own strategy. So that's something to be very clear about, though. If you have a great strategy and it's working and you're bringing in a new president, then that would be a substantial conversation I would want to have. Is this somebody who's good at implementing, or is this someone who's blue sky and going to come in with 3 new ideas?
Great.
Internal changes are at hand. Again, there's something going on in the organization where our products are changing or whatever, and or our work team is aged out, or we got a couple key executives that are moving. What's going on internally? There's some external change going on in the marketplace. Just think of the big banks here after the financial crisis, and community banks are having a terrifically difficult time responding to all the regulation.
And we see this in the nonprofit sector.
Yep.
Some of the states are in great shape.
Right.
Some states are as much as $8 billion in the red.
Right. Here's one that's a little obtuse, but it's my favorite one, and it's usually where the magic comes. There's some key dilemma to be worked out in the organization, and people scratch their head on that and don't have time to get into that. But every organizations have dilemmas. Every organizations have dilemmas. And every organization has secrets, every organization has mysteries, every organization has myths, MYTHS. You have to get down to what is it in our organization that we need to talk about that most people aren't talking about. And it's funny, the people in the organization know. You just got to give them to tell the truth. Here's another one that is very, very real. The organization is focused internally instead of on customers or competitors. And you get around an organization, you know whether they're focused on, last time you went to the license bureau to get yourself a driver's license, are they focused on customers?
I would gladly pay for customer service training for that group.
Yeah. Actually, just an anecdotal comment, there's actually 2 types of license bureaus. There's the state-owned, and then there's the vendors, contract people. The contract people have actually gotten very savvy and very smart. You can make appointments online, all kinds of neat stuff. So anyway, are you focused internally or externally? Or there's some compelling internal or external influence, specifically external. You got a board that's on you. You got accrediting bodies that are after you. You got regulatory matters, etc. And then the last one is just plain old-fashioned. Your operating model's failing. We've done it this way for 20 or 30 years, and it's not working anymore. So let's get to some tips. So how do you get it just right? Well, number 1, you have leadership focused on telling the truth. That's everything. You have a great process. Number 2, you refuse a weak strategy. A lot of people just simply are okay with a weak strategy, and you have to go after it. I'm going with a technical the term here for number 4, act early in the S curve. If you study management science, there's a concept known as jumping the S curve. The growth of an organization follows an S. As you go up the S, the time to kind of change your model and to start thinking about new ideas is where you're on the way up, not before you're on the way down. And then you have to identify your critical issues. And again, we've talked about what are the key 2 or 3 issues. You have to know your critical issues. Look, there's smart people out there. There's smart customers. There's smart markets. There's smart directors. There's smart trustees. There's smart employees. And you have to know where to start. One of my favorite stories is I love, as you know, working with colleges and universities. I've worked with a lot. You get these brilliant people a lot of times who, they live in their heads. And I walked in to work with one college president who was having some major challenges. And I walked in and I said, well, the first thing you got to do is kind of identify your critical issues. Where he opened his top right-hand drawer, pulled out the list. There was, typed up, 28 issues. These are the 28 issues that we've identified. And he was right. He had 20. I said, well, there's the good news and bad news. Let's walk through this together, you and I, over lunch. And when we had it all said and done, there was 3 issues on there that A, were bet the farm issues, and B, nobody was wanting to touch, and C, really only he and the board could deal with. And there they were right there, the critical issues. Saved a lot of work, a lot of time. It was great. So you have to know where to start and what your critical issues are. And that's the reality. The other part about that story was nobody in their right mind, no matter even if they're an Ivy League PhD, can deal with 28 issues at one time. You can really only deal with 2 or 3 of them.
And I have a similar story about working in Rwanda. I was with a guy who was a big-time farmer. He said he was a farmer. He was in agribusiness. Mm-hmm. And we went to this Maasai village.
As in the tribe?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And there was a Maasai gentleman named Barnabas, and he had a huge tomato field with about 100 women picking tomatoes. And the farmer from the United States said, what you need is a John Deere tractor. And if I can get you a John Deere tractor and blah, 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 John Deere, blah, 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 blah. And I stopped, and I'm a social worker. I know nothing about agriculture. And the one question I asked that stopped everything cold is, how many children do these women support?
And a tractor was going to take away their livelihood.
They had an average of 3 children. So the next question I asked is there a John Deere dealership in Rwanda? No.
Yeah.
The next question was,
can you get it repaired?
Can you get gasoline?
Absolutely no.
And what this farmer, who was a really smart guy, said, how much are you getting for your tomatoes? And he told him, and he said, what you need is an expensive crop like asparagus.
Or strawberries.
Well, asparagus is actually
the priciest market out there?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And each asparagus, to make white asparagus, has to be covered. And he worked with them. But this was a complete outsider who knew nothing about it.
Well, and that's a good tip about strategy. A lot of times it is the outsider who can ask the
naive question.
The naive question, and that's the matter about getting to strategy. And I say, I always knew you were a strategic thinker. There you have it. So let's get through some of these critical issues pretty quickly here. Look, here are critical issues in the generic form. You have to have clarity and truthfulness. You have to manage conflicts. Almost always there's conflicts around the board table or between management that people don't manage, and you got to manage them well. Do you compromise or not? Most of the time people want compromises, and there are things you can't compromise on. My story about the college president, those 3 issues they were bet the farm issues, and they had danced around them for a decade, and without attacking those 3, they weren't getting anywhere, and they were compromising. That's why they were failing. You got to have competence. You got to have congruence at all levels of the system. And there's crisis. Look, and when you're in a crisis, there's question. You can have all these cute sayings. You can't shrink to greatness, i.e., well, we're not going to cut our budget. And then you turn around one day and, we have to, versus you can't grow out of a deficit, how do you grow, et cetera. And then there's the issues of growth versus efficiency. And then there's the ever-present, the numbers don't lie, you don't see that there, but it's your cost structure. You got to have numbers that work, okay? So really back to the issue of strategy and change, it's about achieving real change. If you want to achieve real change, you have to have a great strategy. And whether it's merely balancing a budget or totally changing the nature of the organization. And what we see today is most organizations are going through radical transformational change, whether they know it or not. And you have to have a board and a management that's on the same page. And back to the beginning, doesn't matter who's in charge, who's doing it, it has to get done. You have to work together. They all have to be plugged in. So real strategic change is about creating something new, and that often means facing reality. Absolutely. So when you focus on strategy, strategy is critical to your success. But here's the now here's the a soft underbelly. And you've experienced this, I'm sure. For most organizations, real strategy is ignored, and here's what it's ignored. We either do tactical things, or we do safe incremental steps. It gets micromanaged to death by vested interests, i.e. I'm not going to change, and there's often lots of process and very little action, and you have to have action to get things done. So here's some of the key aspects of a change. You got to have awareness, understanding, attitude. You got to have motivation, skills, opportunity, and you have to know your historical context. Here's some realities from a very good book on managing change. Change is painful, creates resistance. Those patterns are predictable. You got to have leadership if you're going to have change, and you got to be resilient.
And that's the name of the game.
So, strategy and the management change. We're going back to a top line where we've been. Just another slide or two. Strategy is as serious as a heart attack. Leadership's a foul weather job. That was another one of my favorite Druckerisms. Nobody needs a captain of the ship when the weather's fine. Real change is possible. Not only is it possible, it's imperative. And for many, strategy means creating something new. So, here's a question for you. When does change happen?
It happens when it needs to happen.
Yep. And here's my response to that. I have 3 responses. I'm going to add a 4th now. It happens when it needs to happen. First one is it happens when you have to.
Yep.
The second one is it happens when you run out of business.
Mm-hmm.
The third one is it happens when you run out of cash.
And a 4th one is it happens when there's an opportunity.
Absolutely. So a final statement here now. Now I'm actually going to the old-fashioned therapy crowd here about change. And again, we've talked about linking strategy and change. Look, action beats process, and again, we've both worked in many an organization, especially in the not-for-profit world, where they want to process things to death. And process is important, but you got to have action. So here's one of the great sayings about change and strategy from a great psychotherapist over the years, Abraham Lowe, and here's what he said, and I encourage you to memorize it. He said, intellectualizing about our problems, what do you think that goes in here, is blank, but E. The answer is intellectualizing about our problems is complex but easy, while doing something about them is simple but difficult.
Exactly.
Great to be with you today to talk strategy, and whether it's the board or management, who knows, but whatever it is, you got to make sure you get it right.
If you don't, it's as serious as a heart attack.
All right.
Thanks
See you
so
later.
much.
Bye.
Thank you again to Tom and Carol for your wonderful insight today. If you have any questions or comments for today's speakers, their contact information is on the screen. If you have interest in learning more about BoardPack, please send us an email, sales@boardpack.com.